Ariane. So next we have Ariane and David, and she's possibly going to be talking about non-positional thinking applied to sustainable peace, resource, equity, and social justice.
So those of you who know me know that my interest has always been, at least through this organization, has always been through thinking, how we think. You know, Einstein said that every problem in the world begins first with how we think about it, and that we can't change it until we change our thinking. And what I discovered in the years that I did consulting with organizations, public and private sector, was that people were willing to change transactionally. So they were willing to do things differently. They were willing to have a different form, a different program, different departments, but they weren't willing to change how they thought. And I ultimately got out of consulting because I thought, I can't do this anymore. Because the one thing that I am interested in, that I know is at the basis of every transformation, is what most companies don't want to do, and you know this. So I started developing my model of non-positional thinking, and it's a model that really took about 20 years to develop, and it's something that has formed the core of the curriculum of all of my classes, whatever the class was: leadership, public sector management, ethics. All of that came down to non-positional thinking and systems thinking. So a bunch of years ago, I got to thinking about, well, so this is how we think as individuals and as organizations. But what about as a world? How can we change our thinking as a world to solve the problems that we have? So one of the things that we know about the world is that we suffer from chronic warfare. And, you know, I know Steven Pinker's a wonderful guy, and I know that his opinion is that we've gotten less violent, but we've only gotten less violent because we haven't gone back far enough. Because if we go back far enough in the history of humanity, what we see is that there was not chronic warfare forever. That for the first 250,000 years of our existence as Homo sapiens, there was no war. There were skirmishes, there was certainly interpersonal conflict. But war leaves traces. And there literally are no traces of war until about 13,000 years ago, but really 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago is the first site that archaeologists have found where we can say, yeah, this is probably pretty much war. You see multiple people with defensive kind of injuries, you know, breaks to the forearm, broken craniums, etc. But that's really when war started appearing. But even then, it was very, very rare. But by 6,000 years ago, during the Bronze Age, now we see evidence of war chronically, all the time. We see settlements that are developed with fortifications. We find graves. We find, and not only warfare, but now we start seeing hierarchy develop. We start seeing poverty. We start seeing great wealth. We start seeing evidence of slavery, and we see evidence of women having lost their power. Because for the first 250,000 years, as Homo sapiens, by looking at graves, by analyzing the nutrition through the content of bones, we see that women and men were pretty much equal. There was really no difference in the way men and women were buried, in the quality of the grave goods, in the quality of their nutrition. And now suddenly, by the Bronze Age, we're seeing big differences in the way men and women are buried, in the nutrition of men and women. I never started that, sorry. Okay, great. So something took place between 10,000 and 6,000 years ago that changed the way we think as a world. And so that has been my interest, applying non-positional thinking to that huge transition that happened. And a lot of things happened. The agricultural revolution happened, that Jared Diamond calls, pardon? Yes, he calls that the greatest catastrophe of humanity. I mean, how could developing agriculture be the greatest catastrophe of humanity? Well, it was the greatest catastrophe of humanity because that process, which by the way was a 4,000-year process. You know, it wasn't like, oh, I'm going to go plant grain, and suddenly, you know, within 2 years we have the agricultural revolution. You know, rice took 4,000 years to be domesticated. So this was a long, long process. And because it was such a long process, people didn't notice the change. Because in any single lifetime, there were no huge changes, but it was an inexorable juggernaut that just kept moving along. So something radical changed during that time. And I'm not, you know, I can go into details, but we only have 3 minutes more. So, but here's the thing that's important. This is what's really important. What's really important is for us to understand that war, wealth inequality, poverty, is not innate. We've always been taught that we do war because we have to do war, because the gorillas do war. They don't actually. But the chimpanzees do war. So we do it because it's in our blood. The problem with that way of thinking is that there's no solution. If it's in our blood, we can't not do it. Human beings can't not talk. We can't not cry. We can't not smile. Because it's in our blood. And if we say war is in our blood, we can't change it. If we say wealth inequality is in our blood, we can't change it. So the power of thinking in understanding our history is that we can see that the thinking changed, that the change is cultural, that the change is learned, that we don't have to have war. Steven Pinker is wrong. Civilization is not what is saving us. Going back to who we are as human beings is what's going to save us. Thank you.
We had a little dialogue in
No, not a dialogue.
I just wanted to ask a question.
You can ask a question.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
So, I mean, you could argue, so I've been really studying the history of thinking, and like from bilateral stuff, and sort of the difference between species that were experienced. And it was always a predatory knowledge. So could it be that agricultural civilization, based on Jared's French steel synopsis of it, was that was sort of reconciled? I mean, I get your point, and I totally agree with you about the way we think. But I think there was sparse evidence for what was before it was civilized.
Correct.
So I don't know that you could make the argument that we always did, that was something new that happened 10,000 years ago. Because and I'm not an expert in this, but the historical evidence of humans being predatory, including us since the worms came out.
Well, you know, so that's a great question, and it's very funny because we tend to think of man the hunter. We tend to think of that for 250,000, our first 250,000 years before we started planting wheat, we lived on meat, and that's not accurate. Up until agriculture, you know, women were the primary foragers, and they accounted for about 70% of the calories consumed by the band, because hunting was not really accurate. So, you know, we hunted as part of the cycle of nature.
I'm talking about